great to hear all that conversation going. It's such a pity to stop it. But you'll have plenty of chance to catch up and, meet new friends, catch up with old friends in the hub after the event this evening. So for those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet, I'm Anita Arbogast. I am the Executive Director of the Centre for Business Analytics. And it's so wonderful to see you all here in three-dimensional shapes rather than just a flat two-dimensional group. And it's actually been our first in-person Talking Data series for the Centre, I think, in the last 2 years. So we're really delighted that you could join us on this very special occasion. So on behalf of Melbourne Business School, I would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this session today on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, which is where the school's building currently stands. So we would like to pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging. And, it's a really important part of the tradition of the school to acknowledge our elders. So we at the Centre have always had a lovely group of corporate members who support all of our events and make these opportunities possible for our constituents. So we actually have a few of our colleagues from members here today with us. We see a contingent of Nick Pole up there. We also welcome members from Suncorp, Jobs Victoria. We have colleagues from EY, Deloitte, and various others joining us this evening as well. And also in attendance, we also have two of our Industry Advisory Board members over there, Dr. Greg Hill and Jane Eastgate, who've joined us. Our Industry Advisory Board guides the Centre's curriculum for our students, and it also guides our strategy and our activities. So we are grateful for their support and guidance as well. So as we get back to the new normal, you'll also see a bunch of Melbourne Business School sweatshirts in the audience. We have a group of our Master of Business Analytics students, our new cohort of students who joined us just a couple of weeks ago in March. So they are in the audience as well. And so in addition to having them here in real life, it's just fabulous to have real people facing us, in the audience today. So housekeeping is a little bit different from the virtual events we've been running for the last 2 years. We'll actually have 45 minutes of presentation tonight, followed by Q&A. So please save your questions as you think of them for the end of the session. So there will be the opportunity to ask questions at the very end. And bathrooms, something we didn't have to think about in terms of the virtual world, are outside. There's signage, and if ever in doubt, just please ask. And as I mentioned, there'll be the opportunity for you all to reconnect, meet new friends afterwards in the hub across the way until about, I think, 8 o'clock we have the facility. So this official programming will finish around 7, and then we'll head on over to the hub afterwards. So on to the topic of this evening. So I think I mentioned on LinkedIn, unless you've been hiding under a rock for the last 2 years, you've probably noticed various occasions where supermarket shelves have been empty, either of toilet paper or of meat and produce, or the beloved rat tests in January that became as precious as gold. So whether it's shocks related to the demand side, like toilet paper, or on the supply side, like produce and rat tests, we'll be focusing this evening on the lessons learned in supply chains during this 2-year pandemic and that we've been facing. So it also gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Yalçın Akçay joined Melbourne Business School in 2017 and is currently the Deputy Director of the Centre for Business Analytics. So this is his first official engagement for the Centre. Yalçın has a dual title PhD in Business and Operations Research from Penn State University, and he was a Professor of Operations for 15 years in Turkey before joining MBS. So Yalçın's research focuses on revenue management, dynamic pricing, inventory management, retail operations, stochastic modelling of service and manufacturing systems. So please make sure you ask him lots of great questions. He has published extensively in flagship journals, such as Management Science, Operations Research, and has received multiple Best Paper awards for his articles. So Yalçın also teaches operations management to our MBA, Executive MBA, and Senior Executive MBA programs. So with that, I'll hand over to Yalçın.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to really see you face to face. What I'll do today is I'll start with a brief history lesson because, as I said, hindsight is 2020. So we have learned, operations managers, researchers, and practitioners learned a ton of new things through the events of last 2 years. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you an index that is developed by the Fed in New York. It's the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. It captures 27 different variables ranging from cost parameters in cross-border transport, country-level, country-specific manufacturing data from the Eurozone, from the US, from Asia, from Taiwan, all of these countries you can have, these are variables that drive this index. So what I'm showing you here is the standard deviation of this index over the course of the last 10, 15 years, okay? So standard deviation, as you might recall, is a measure of risk. So it measures the magnitude of risk that we observe over the last 10, 15 years. And by just observing this index, we can quantify that actually the level of risk related to global supply chains has been on the increase for the past 10, 15 years. And there were a lot of drivers of this. I'm going to talk about two key drivers. The first one is the successful implementation of outsourcing and offshoring, okay? So with globalization, the economic reforms in China in late 70s, very efficient transport systems, developments in the information and digital technologies, organizations and companies observe that there's actually great potential to save costs. And by offshoring, they were able to realize higher levels of profits. And that was a key performance metric for organizations. So they were able to reduce their assets. Consumers had access to cheaper products, cheaper goods, and it actually contributed to reducing the level of poverty in a lot of countries, okay? The second, on the cost side though, it led to losing of manufacturing capacity in a lot of developed countries. So if you look at historical data, you see that although the real output of manufacturing has increased, the number of jobs available in manufacturing has declined over time. And this, because of its nature, that you're having to produce things in different geopolitical regions, it increased the overall risk of the system. And the same thing is valid for Australia. You see that the share of manufacturing jobs has been on the decline for some time. So this led to decline on capability in terms of manufacturing. Now, the second thing that contributed to the increase in the global supply chain risk is the introduction of the lean approach. So what is lean? It tries to get rid of all excess waste in organizations, and inventory is one of these biggest items of waste. And Toyota, about 50 years ago, introduced this genius idea that, well, in an environment that doesn't show a lot of variation or uncertainty, and then you can very efficiently optimize your system. You will not order or you will not get any goods unless you need them and there is demand for them. This is the just-in-time principle. Whenever there is volatility in demand, well, this philosophy might have some tough time. And actually, you'll see in 2011 with the events that happened in Japan and Thailand, the earthquake and the following tsunami, well, a lot of organizations were actually negatively impacted, okay? And these organizations, Toyota, Nissan, Fujitsu, they were able to maneuver through this disruption, okay? One thing that we're going to observe about this disruption, at the time it was a major disruption to supply chains, by the way, it was very local, it was a localized disaster. It affected manufacturing capacities of a few organizations. So within a few days, manufacturing capacity of Toyota declined by 60%, and it had a huge impact. But on the flip side, globally, it did not have any effect on the demand, customer demand for the products, okay? So those are the things that were different. Now, looking at this in the past 10, 15 years, the new part of the graph that I'm showing you is this index in the last 2 years, okay? So you see that the order of risk is completely, in terms of magnitude, many times more than what we have observed, even in the period that we had significant increase in supply chain risks, okay? Now, what is different now? What was different now in the past 2 years with the pandemic? First of all, it was a global event. It is not a localized disaster. It started somewhere in China, and gradually it reached all parts of the world, okay? And every single country in the world eventually went into lockdowns, facilities were shut down. It had a huge impact globally, okay? That is one big difference that we have. Well, if you start the first few months or weeks of the pandemic, it started also with bad predictions. What were these predictions? Well, organization thought that there is going to be, with the lockdowns, there is going to be a major hit to consumer demand. So they decided very quickly to shut down their warehouses, production facilities, laid employees off, okay? But that didn't happen. What happened was actually very short-lived decline in demand for consumer goods. There was a shift in demand, so people didn't go to restaurants, didn't buy theater tickets, didn't go to movies, but instead they didn't travel for sure. Instead they bought stuff, okay? So, so what happened? All right, okay. COVID. Okay, so graphs that we have all over the world, there was a sharp decline, but with stimulus packages, with consumers being paid extra money just to spend, we saw that very quickly, especially durable good demand picked up, surpassed what it was before COVID, okay? So this is a huge shift in consumer demand. Now, it also triggered the surge in e-commerce, right? We know that the prevalence of e-commerce has been on the increase for quite some time, but COVID simply triggered an extra nudge, okay? So on this graph, what you see here is too small probably to read, but the yellow line is the number of COVID cases over time. It's increasing. And the other graphs are showing simply Google searches for food delivery, online shopping. So there are some people, or there were some people who never did that, so they had to learn more about that. And you can see that it is increasing over time. And this is a very striking graph from the UK. You see that the percentage of e-commerce has been on the rise over time. And in just 2020-21, it saw an additional spike that is very, very observable. Okay, so that is mainly due to the shift in demand. Another thing that we don't usually see in supply chains is capacity concerns for the transportation network, okay? So I preach operations, I say it's all about establishing match between demand and supply. We have a lot of tools for that. Over time, we didn't see a lot of disruptions in the transportation network. There's a lot of capacity, but it wasn't the case during COVID. And that's what also went wrong during the pandemic. There were a multitude of factors. First, if you remember at the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of demand for masks and some personal safety equipment, okay? And majority of those producers were in China. They shipped a ton of those masks to all over the world, okay? What happens in global supply chains is 90% of transportation is by sea, and 70% of all transportation is through containers in intermodal transportation, okay? And those containers were shipped all over the world to send the much needed supplies, and they remained idle at those ports all over the world for a long, long time. And whenever there was demand for those containers, there simply wasn't enough containers to ship from Australia to China, China to US. That was one constraint. Another thing happened was organizations before pandemic, some organizations did not invest in warehouses, and there was a lot of need for warehouses during the pandemic. And there were some companies out there that used ports as their warehouses, okay? So they would receive their shipment in containers. They would simply not pick up those containers from the port. They would sit there as if it's their warehouse, okay? And it occupied this very valuable resource, the containers that we have. Another thing that was different is there was a very big shortage in terms of personnel. So even if the containers were shipped, because of COVID restrictions and because of isolation rules, there was no people to actually empty those containers. Another thing, good career advice for you, if you don't probably have a university degree, is there is an enormous shortage of truck drivers in the world. There are not enough truck drivers in the world. In the US alone, in 2021, they estimated there is a shortage of 800,000 truck drivers that are needed urgently for the supply chain to be able to propagate, okay? So these are all different things that happened before, and they're not similar to the previous disruptions that we observed in the world. And, well, I'm not going to take the whole blame for the failure of supply chains, because since early 2000s, we've been preaching the value of supply chain resilience, okay? And supply chain resilience, there's a lot of literature on this, essentially calls for a few things about your supply chain network, okay? But one of those things is very crucial. It requires organizations to know every single node in their network, okay? Which is not a trivial task. So if you're an organization, it is not sufficient for you to just know your first tier suppliers, second tier, third tier, and all other tiers. It is a very, very challenging task, but if you want to be resilient, this is what you need, okay? Here is an award-winning approach to assessing supply chain risk, okay? So this framework is developed by David Simchi-Levy, a professor of MIT. It won numerous awards in Ford, in the operations research area, in practice. It's been practiced in pharmaceutical industry, telecommunications, in terms of assessing the risk in supply chains, okay? Now, if you're Ford, you might have multiple products and you have your facilities to manufacture these products. And you have your tier one suppliers. I'm assuming everyone knows a lot about their tier one suppliers. Well, the suppliers that you use in tier one, they also have their own suppliers, and those suppliers have their own set of suppliers. So this is what we refer to as the complete picture of the supply network, okay? And for you to accurately assess the risk in your supply chain, you better have a good understanding of what your supply network looks like. So this methodology is very straightforward, actually. It says once you have the network, pick up any node in your network. It is going to be a supplier. And go and ask that supplier certain set of questions. And one of the first questions you're going to ask is, if there is a major disruption for you, how much time do you need to recover? Okay? And they're going to come up with an assessment of that. It's going to be based on their own models or based on their gut feelings, but this is some information. A lot of suppliers will tend to overestimate this, okay? So in return, what you do is, as the organization, you estimate another value, time to survive. So time to survive is, given the current supply chain network and allocation of your resources, what would happen if that node failed, okay? How long could you survive and your operations would not be disrupted? This is time to survive. And the difference between these two time periods is very critical, because if your time to survive exceeds time to recover, then that node is not going to present a risk for you, because essentially your supply will not be disrupted. But if it's the vice versa, if your time to survive is less than your time to recover, then it's going to imply a supply chain disruption. Now, what they do with this model in assessing the supply risk is they run simulation models, optimization models, and so forth, and they calculate on any given performance metric the impact on the performance metric that you choose. It can be your profitability, it can be the delivery time, whatever you pick. And it can be calculated or estimated computationally using simulation models. And here is what they observed for Ford, okay, once they did that analysis. On the vertical axis, what you see is the total spend on the supplier side, okay? So, of course, Ford has numerous suppliers. And on the horizontal axis, you see the performance impact. What a lot of organizations do is they tend to focus on this group of suppliers, okay? Who are these suppliers? These are your major suppliers. You spend a lot of money with them, okay? But they present very little risk for you. If there's a disruption in the supply chain related to those suppliers, it is not going to, your performance is not going to take a huge hit. What you better do is look at these ones, okay? Your focus should be on those small, seemingly small suppliers that you deal with. You don't purchase much from them, but they present a lot of risk for you, okay? So this methodology tells you where to focus and do something about those suppliers. And there are different approaches to be more resilient to disruptions of such suppliers, okay? So what are those things? I'll try to summarize them for you. I'm not going to cover everything, but the first thing that pops to your mind is flexibility, okay? This can be in terms of inventory flexibility, it can be in terms of process flexibility. Lean, that relies on running the system very cost efficiently, is going to sneer at you if you say, I want excess process flexibility or I want excess inventory in the system. It is something that Lean will not agree with, okay? But here is what the supply chain for Ford looks like and versus the supply chain of Nissan in terms of their manufacturing sites, okay? So what you see is different models for Ford and Nissan cars and trucks, and you see that they're produced at various facilities, okay? Now, one thing that you might notice, in general, Ford produces each model in a single factory, whereas if you look at Nissan, for example, the Sentra model can be produced essentially in two different facilities. If you look at Versa, again, two different facilities. Okay, so there is some flexibility. And this turns out to be hugely, hugely impactful during times of disruption. even seemingly small levels of flexibility in your production system or your supplier's production systems will allow them to quickly shift production capacity from one model to another one, okay? And, well, ideally, of course, I would want to have a very flexible production system, okay? So if I'm producing, for example, 10 products and I have 10 manufacturing facilities, I would ideally want each production facility to be flexible enough to produce everything. It is going to be very costly, okay? And you don't need this because you have operations research and there's an existing line of literature which says even small or relatively small levels of flexibility that you have in the system, if you can rightly configure it, can achieve the benefits of a full flexible system, okay? So, So here is one. So in the graph on the left that you see, each facility can only produce 2 products. They're not fully flexible, but if you configure them like this, they're almost as flexible as a fully flexible system, okay? So you need to use some advanced analytics methods to decide on what level of flexibility is optimal for you, okay? And again, assigning 2 products to each production facility is not enough. It is about the right configuration. We refer to this as a chain configuration in supply chains. And what you see here is the first chain, which is actually a very long chain, is going to significantly outperform what you have in the second configuration, okay? So there are analytics methodologies out there that help organizations determine what level of flexibility is optimal for them, okay? Because there is, of course, a trade-off. The second thing that we are going to push for is transparency and visibility, okay? So there are technologies out there, and I'll briefly talk about it towards the end, that enable this transparency and visibility. Now, historically, what transparency and visibility means is if you are part of the supply chain, you should be able to see every single player in the entire network, okay? That is what we refer to as the visibility. Now, according to a very recent survey, just before the pandemic, the Business Continuity Institute's report said almost 80% of organizations don't know something about their supply networks, okay? Don't know their second-tier suppliers or third-tier suppliers because it's very complicated. And they did not need to know them, okay? Because there was, relatively speaking, very little randomness in the operating environment, okay? And very few disruptions. Nothing in the magnitude that we ever experienced. Who could have imagined we would be in lockdown for 2 years? Nobody expected something like this, okay? So what it requires you is to actually have a mapping of your supply network, complete mapping. If you haven't done this last year, you should do it this year. So this is what a lot of organizations are actually striving to map out now. They're trying to get a full picture of what their supply network looks like, because if you don't have the transparency, it is one excellent way of hiding all the risks associated with them, okay? So this requires, as I said, transparency. What does transparency mean? Let's say I'm a big customer, okay, the final end node in the supply chain, and there are many smaller players that supply. They might be tier 3, tier 4 suppliers that are suppliers of my suppliers, okay? Historically, they said, why would I ever share my data with them? What is sharing data? It might be their demand data. It might be their cost structures. They had no intentions of sharing them. Their fear was, well, if I share all this information, they might squeeze me out of the supply network, okay? Now, there are ways of encouraging participants in a supply chain to actually reveal truth about themselves, their cost structures, what their demands are. And now we have lived through a period of extensive 2 years where if you don't actually share your data and if you're not transparent, you might not be a player in the supply chain anymore, because a lot of organizations are going to ask for this, okay? So this is the norm now. It wasn't the norm before. Nobody wanted to ever share information. When you share information, of course, it's about sharing the data. You have to make sure that it is the correct data, because there is also a concept of accumulation of errors. If you put together a bunch of garbage together to actually predict something, it's going to produce just garbage, which is going to be probably misleading you even further, okay? Another concept that we have is diversification, okay? So even Toyota, before the pandemic, they noticed that they recognized the fact that they had to diversify their suppliers. But they lost track of the story, and they weren't fully aware of what their second, third, fourth tier suppliers look like. So the one thing that they noticed after the disruption was, for let's say this part, they thought they're supplying it from 2 different suppliers, okay? So they were diversifying their risk. But what they noticed later on was the supplier of these 2 suppliers were the same. So essentially, they're replicas of each other. So you have not achieved any kind of diversification by doing so, okay? And that is a big thing, again, signaling that you have to have an excellent understanding of what your supply network looks like. Go to your supplier, figure out what their suppliers are, go to their suppliers and ask what their suppliers are. That is the way to figure out what your supply network looks like. And another thing that we push for in resilience is you have to create redundancy, okay? So you might have decided that you're going to work with these 2 suppliers. Well, do some more work. It is going to be more costly for you, but come up with alternative suppliers. A third supplier that you don't work now, but it's in your supply network. You might be paying some cost to keep it in your supply network, but that cost will be recovered in multitudes when there is a big disruption, okay? And that is actually, during the pandemic, a lot of organizations that survived and turned the story back and became very successful, they had access to a lot of different suppliers from different geographical regions. That is how you do it. And this is going to be much cheaper than trying to do it during a disruption, okay? During a disruption, the onboarding cost is going to be excessive. You might not even have the quality that you ask for. Another thing that you have to make sure is, well, if you want a resilient supply chain, you should do it from the start, even at the product design stage. Don't use components that can only be supplied by a single unique supplier, okay? Design so that they can be produced or manufactured or supplied by multiple different producers in the network. All right. Another story that you keep hearing about in terms of how to achieve resilience is onshoring, okay? So at the start of the pandemic, the first thing that you kept hearing from a lot of organizations was that, well, the reason why we're suffering at the moment is our global supply chains are like big snakes. They're very long. They're all over the world, and we have to bring things closer, okay? You cannot have global supply chains anymore because a disruption like the one that we had is going to be very disruptive, okay? Now, before COVID, the World Health Organization actually estimated the risk associated with the pandemic, okay? Their risk assessment was that it is less than likely, but its impact was significantly more than average. Well, for such an event, making preparations or taking insurance actions is very costly from the shareholder perspective, okay? Because it's something that never will ever will happen. Well, one thing that we observed is it will happen, it might happen, and it might go on for a few years, not just a few weeks. So onshoring was completely bringing all production to local countries. US, for example, thought about bringing everything back home, creating new jobs. If you think about it, that is not probably a feasible thing to do, because after a while, it won't be very cost effective and you won't be able to compete because of labor costs involved, you won't be able to compete with a lot of your competitors. Then there are new ideas now about shoring and nearshoring. That means, well, our supply chains don't need to be like big snakes anymore. We will try to bring them closer, not all the way down to Australia, but bring them closer. So we will try to find out suppliers or manufacturers that even if it's very cost ineffective for us to do in Australia, we might want to explore options of going with New Zealand or closer islands or some ideas around that. So US, for example, is going with Canada, Mexico, and trying to increase their investments in those. Next thing that I want to say is understand your customers better, okay? That is one thing driving resilience. Now, we should accept the fact that the behavior of consumers in the last few years and before that was somewhat toxic, okay? We ordered something online and we wanted it yesterday, okay? It should just show up at our doorstep. And a lot of organizations pick that as their key metric and opened a ton of new warehouses. Amazon started with 5 distribution houses and now has 110 and opening more. And then a lot of organizations actually strived to deliver now. That is not what actually your customers prefer, okay? So there is a lot of study around understanding customer preferences. So there was a study that said, okay, if we gave you a more precise delivery window just by 1 hour, okay? The study found that customers or consumers are willing to wait almost 1 more day for that, okay? Another thing that was figured out is if you also allowed a preference on the delivery day, okay? So you might say, I want it next Friday or on Monday. Well, customers actually value this more and they're willing to wait an extra half day for this, okay? So there is evidence that we might have run or applied a lot of pressure on our supply chains in vain for something that customers don't necessarily prefer. They might have other preferences. So it is really important to understand all of this. All right. And the last thing that is going to actually enable resilience is analytics, okay? Now, one of the things that you might keep hearing about is supply chain control towers or digital twins. All of these things require very advanced analytics to actually have an impact on the resilience of your organization and the supply chain. So a control tower is just like at an airport, okay? Is going to give you full visibility to all players on your supply network, okay? It is very connected. You have real-time data and you have dashboards and you can very easily have access to any performance metric that's important to you, okay? Now, the critical thing here is that this requires, of course, transparency and visibility. So the different parties should be willing to actually share this data. And you have to make sure it's correct. And you actually need tools to be able to process this data in real time. Otherwise, you're stuck at the descriptive stage of analytics, okay? So ideally, we want this control tower to be in such a state that it enables decision makers to make real-time decisions whenever they observe something that is going wrong in their entire supply chain. It might be a strike at an airport, it might be something else. They should be able to quickly find new route patterns, new supply chain configurations, alternate suppliers, and this needs to be in real time for you to be resilient. And the level of depth that you can go into is you can start with visibility, having access to all these observations at various stages, all the way up to having a very autonomous system, like an Industry 4.0 kind of setting, okay? And it will, once the system detects different things happening in the supply chain, any kind of disruption, it might be weather related, it might be some supply related, it is going to autonomously make the optimal decision to drive success. And this is what we refer to as digital twins, is the heart of these control towers. So digital twin is a simulation model which replicates essentially or represents digitally what's happening with any physical thing. You might have a digital twin for a machine, for an entire factory, and for the entire supply network, okay? So there are different frameworks that you have for these digital twins. Essentially what it does is it's an advanced analytics tool that simulates in real time, having access to real-time data across all over the supply chain, okay? It will simulate different disruptions, okay? So it might be weather-related strikes, financial disasters, and your analytics and big data here is going to put these all together, essentially, and create what-if scenarios. What if this happens? What if that happens? And you don't do this offline. This is done online, meaning that while things are actually happening in the physical world, okay? Well, I was a TA 25 years ago for a subject called business simulation. So simulation is nothing new. It's been there for a long, long time. What has changed is the level of computational power, enabling you to do very accurate representations of physical things. Simulation in the past had to be a really high-level approximation. And then the other thing that happened is having access to real-time data and also having the processing capacity to process that big data, okay? At the heart of this, you're going to have your machine learning AI modules, but also you're going to have your optimization models because you want this to help you in decision making and you want guidance, and an optimization model is going to help you out. And this is going to, the digital twin is actually going to sit at the heart of the entire framework that you have. So what you're going to have is, you're going to have the physical chain that continuously in real time feeds in data to the system from all players in your supply network, okay? It is essentially useless to have such an advanced model if you don't have full visibility of your supply network. You're going to have this, and you're going to do tons of modeling because you want to be able to capture what is happening physically. A ton of scenario analysis will happen. You're going to simulate all possible scenarios. It is continuously going to help you control the supply levels, inventory levels, routing patterns. It is all going to be dictated, and you can actually use all of this in pre-disruption stage, during the actual disruption, and post-disruption, okay? So what this calls for is advanced analytics, as I meant. It is asking for organizations to move beyond diagnostic and descriptive analytics. It's asking them to go into predictive and prescriptive models. That is what you need to actually help you be more resilient in managing these supply chains, okay? So these are just some of the ideas for building a resilient supply chain, but there are significantly more. As I said, there is a huge literature in operations research actually trying to drive the resilience aspect. But we failed because we were preaching too much on the operational efficiencies of things, being cost effective. That turned out to be one of the key motivations, but we were actually doing our homework. This is very costly for organizations to implement because it is a very rare event that you're preparing for, okay, in most cases. But when it hits it, it can be the end of your organization, major failure, or you can actually leverage the power of data to actually gain enormous success in the organization, in the world, okay? All right, so that's what I have. I might have gone over time.
Perfect timing, Yalçın. Thank you very much
Sure.
for that and sharing your ingredients for a resilient supply chain. So it's your turn. If you have questions, raise your hand, and I'm happy to take the question. Otherwise, I do have a few questions to kick us off, if you'd like. So, Yalçın, obviously you talked about global supply chains and the big snake that wraps around the entire world. What are your thoughts in terms of when those global supply chains might bounce back?
Okay, so that is the million-dollar question, right?
Crystal ball.
So it is a very uncertain world, and we're living through very weird times, right? At the start of the pandemic, I remember reading on CNN that actually a virus was around. It might be a form of flu. Well, who would have guessed that it would ruin lives and it would be what we still keep on talking about after more than 2 years, okay? And it is not that. We're now dealing with another crisis around the world. There is the crisis in Ukraine now, okay? So it is like one thing after another, new variants, new crises in the world. So it is very difficult to say what's going to happen. But I think global supply chains at its best form had its perfect run for 20, 30 years. It is, as we know it, not going to go back to how we knew it before. Because there is a lot of things changing, and we now see that for big organizations specifically, they need to take action. They cannot rely on this blindly getting supply from their producers in Asia or in Europe. They have to have a good understanding, and they have to do things, invest in more flexibility, or they will have to do something related to their analytics capabilities. If you take, for example, the crisis in Ukraine, well, Russia, Ukraine put together, their GDP is going to be less than 1% of the world's total GDP, okay? But it is not like flooding happening in Sydney. It is still a global effect, a global event, and it's going to have a huge impact. If you think about different things that happen in those two countries and what they provide to the world, you might not know it, but you're dealing currently with a huge semiconductor crisis. Ukraine and Russia are suppliers of two very important material that goes into neon and palladium, that goes into the production of semiconductors. So it is going to have a huge impact. Europe almost gets half of its natural gas from Russia, which they've stopped now. The price has increased from the start of 2021. The price of natural gas increased by tenfold. Russia is the biggest exporter of fertilizers in the world, okay? It is going to have a long-running effect because they've banned export of fertilizers now. And a lot of countries, after they rely on having good agriculture. What is more, Ukraine and Russia almost produce 1/3 of the wheat in the world, okay? So, and they are not exporting at the moment. It is going to be creating a lot of shortage of wheat and corn, and especially for underdeveloped countries, it might mean, together with fertilizer, it can have a long-lasting effect in terms of their poverty levels. So even a relatively small thing happening in one part of the world that is not going to affect the world economy significantly is going to have a ripple effect in the global supply chains. And other things are also happening, like increases in the interest rates that didn't happen for the past 3-4 years. They're going to change things. So we have to protect ourselves, take these measures so that we're resilient in terms of the supply chains, and then at least have some competitive advantage in these weird times. Yeah.
Thank you, Yalçın. Multiple questions, this is great. I'll start in the back.
Yeah, so after understanding the pressures in the supply chain and the disruptions it did cause, do we need more regulation or auditing of the companies that have a much larger effect on this whole process? And if so, where should we start?
Okay, so that's an excellent question, right? So the first thing that I mentioned as part of resilience is transparency. Organizations were turning a blind eye to a lot of things happening with their suppliers because they were very cost efficient. Okay, we know those, the sweatshops, the problems with Nike and all other manufacturers. So now, because of also ESG in the world taking, being a very dominant policy overall, well, it calls for these suppliers to truly share their information, and it is who is going to drive that. It is not going to happen on its own maybe, but the big customers, big corporations should force this transparency, and it should start at that level. Otherwise, these things will keep on continuing and will occur. Okay?
Yes, I'm just wondering your view in terms of trade-off between the resilience and the cost efficiency, because the resilience is just to absorb the shock, this kind of disruptions, but the other hand, it's once-off event. By the other hand, you got the ongoing cost efficiency. How?
Right. So decision-making is all about understanding trade-offs, right? So if you pick, for example, flexibility dimension, and you're considering investing in flexibility in your supply chain. Well, the more flexible you want to be, it is going to be more costly, okay? But it's going to protect you against uncertainties and disruptions. So there is the benefit, but there is also the cost associated with it. So what it comes down to is trying to understand what this trade-off is, okay? Capture it accurately as much as you can and find the good operating point, okay? Depending on what performance metric you choose. But if you wanted to minimize costs, well, you won't end up with the most flexible and most resilient supply chain. It has to be a compromise. So it might have to be a proper performance metric for you, which customers actually pay attention to, okay? So any operational decision actually is a trivial decision if there's no trade-off involved. And all of these will be at a trade-off. You're doing things to be more resilient and be prepared against these very rare events, but it might be very costly to do so. So what level of flexibility you need? What is the optimal level of flexibility? There is a lot of academic work going around it. It doesn't need to be based on gut feelings. So that it calls for, again, a collaboration between universities, academics, and industry and organizations. So there are a lot of work, a lot of research actually behind all of this, okay, to make the best decision for you. Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that one? I'm putting on my own finance hat. Has there been any retrospective research? So, for example, it looks like it'll be BAU to plan for redundancy and pay extra to have that flexibility. Have there been any studies like looking at a retrospective, well, I've invested this much to have that flexibility, and looking back over the course of those 10 years, were there any shocks or anything like that, and was it worthwhile? Has there been anything like that done?
Yeah, in the resilience literature, there is. I cannot recall at the top of my mind, but as I said, this started in 2000s, and this model, the supply risk model that I spoke about in detail, was from 2015. And that model is currently actually being used by UN to determine risk levels in supply chains in underdeveloped countries. So it called for a lot of investment on the Ford side, and they rewarded it with the Innovation Award because it had actually resulted in significant gains for them. But it is actually, again, you might end up investing in a lot of things, but there might not be these rare events that is realized. So you might think they're sunk cost, but in theory they are not, because it is going to be a time, there is an unexpected event where you create competitive advantage actually based on those investments.
Thank you. I just put it in following the same question about the business impact analysis. So in reality, you could evaluate the risk magnitude and the likelihood of it happening. What's the cost if you combine it to the likelihood and the magnitude if it happened? What's the cost? And to mitigate that risk, the diversification or the global sourcing, what's the cost to mitigate that risk? And then you get a split point.
Mm-hmm.
But we are talking about the risk that can be predictable for things like pandemic, then it's less likely to
So
be
it doesn't
predictable.
always have to be pandemic level disruption, by the
Yeah.
way, okay? So you might still want to diversify your suppliers because there might be some geopolitical events going on at that part of the world. There might be a lot of strikes going on with the unions and so forth. So it is not always a pandemic that you're trying to protect your organization against. And supplier diversification is actually a very well-studied area in supply chains. We do look at what is the optimal level of diversification you need. It's the supplier selection problem that we look at. So what are the number of extra or redundant suppliers that you might need? So that all can be studied in the frameworks of science. And that is the, I think, beauty of science, that you can make those very complex decisions actually by properly modeling them. But this comes with a footnote. We know that all models are wrong and some are useful. So the useful ones, you should make sure that you model the thing correctly and the data that you actually use to make these predictions or optimize the system, that it doesn't involve biases and other problems related to analytics. Okay, so what you produce will be as good as your data and the model that you put together.
One last question, and then we're happy to take more questions in the hub over drinks and canapes. So maybe one last question over here.
Thanks, Yalçın. I have a more basic question. Let's say you're a multi-brand retailer in Australia and e-commerce only. What practical advice would you have for them? Because I mean, the variability is the suppliers of the manufacturers who are selling to them. Do you have any practical sort of hands-on advice for such a scenario?
I know where you work, so I can give. Huh?
So I don't work there anymore.
Oh, you don't? Okay, you know, that might have changed. Okay.
Anyway, that was different because we were manufacturers.
All right. Okay. So no. In fact, what I said here, when I put this down as, for example, manufacturing flexibility, you can interpret the same identical network as a supply network. So rather than saying I have these 10 different products and they're manufactured at different facilities, you can interpret the same graph as these are my different products with different brands, and I do have multiple suppliers. And the chaining configuration, for example, is directly valid. So if you want multiple sources to supply your brands or products in a purely e-commerce setting, again, what level of flexibility, what configuration of your supply network is optimal to be able to achieve this, the story is going to be exactly the same. So I might have used examples from manufacturing and then product plants. Same thing applies even for pure service system. You can say that, well, I have 10 different services that I offer. I can have my different types of employees. Ideally, I want everyone to be fully flexible, for example, but it's going to be very expensive for me, for the organization. I can optimize the level of flexibility that I want in my employees. So, specific to your question, I think the most important thing for you is to be able to understand your supply network, because you are going to be working with a very complex supply chain, and it is not sufficient just to know your tier 1, tier 2 suppliers. If you don't have full understanding of what their suppliers are, you might be putting all your eggs in one basket, as Toyota did, and we know that they are a best practice. So it's the first thing that any organization should do if they want to make a step in the direction of being resilient is the supply network mapping. And you should then go to all those suppliers and make sure that they are willing to share information. Because otherwise, again, it is as if it's very opaque and you're going to suffer from the same risks related to these supply failures. Okay? All right.
Thank you very much, Yalçın. We're looking forward
Pleasure.
to continuing the conversation with you all over in the hub with some drinks and canapes. Thank you to Harmony Aretha for having and hosting such a lovely event for us. Please make sure to see Zelda and the team, catering in the hub. So thanks very much for coming along, and let's continue the conversation across the way.
Thank you.